was commissioned by Circuit, and the iteration that runs from 2022 to 2023 was curated by May Adadol Ingawanij, and so she's based in between Bangkok and London, and she will be joining us with the discussion as well. But the reason why this event was proposed was because the curator for an exhibition that's where I work, Our Foundation, the curator really felt an affinity in the way that May approached her curatorial framework, and so they're going to be talking about that later, and the discussion is going to be moderated by Tram Luong, who you all know very well, I hope. And yeah, we'll start with the screening, which will last around 45 minutes, after which time you can take a little break, and then the discussion will start promptly at 3, and will run on until around 4:15. So that's just a running order for you. Yeah, so I'll just hand over to Chum in the films.
So just before we get started, the film is about 40 to 45 minutes, give or take. The language is New Zealand English, right? Just a heads up, which is its own kind of beauty and struggle for those who's never heard it before. So just something I want to keep a heads up for everyone now. After the screening, we're going to have maybe a 5 minutes break for people to kind of gather themselves. The restroom at Fulbright, if you have not know where it is right behind this classroom, so that you can have access to it relatively quickly. But now, could someone help me turn off the light? Is that Lee? Thank you.
So we are going to start with the discussion. First of all, thank you so much to everyone for coming, both in Hanoi and here at Fulbright University. And thank you to all the guest speakers for being present in Bangkok for May, in Hanoi for Vân, and also here at Fulbright for Jam. And I'll introduce a little bit about each guest speakers. So May Adadol Ingawanij is a writer, curator, and teacher. She works on Southeast Asian contemporary art, the westernized and decentered histories and genealogies of cinematic arts. Avant-garde legacies in Southeast Asia, forms of future-making in contemporary Global South artistic and curatorial practices, aesthetics and circulation of artists' moving image, art, and independent films belonging to or connected with Southeast Asia. She is Professor of Cinematic Arts and co-director of the Center for Research and Education in Arts and Media at University of Westminster in London. And in Hanoi, we have Van Do. And Van, who is the guest curator for White Noise exhibition, is a Hanoi-based curator and writer whose practice concerns artistic interventions and negotiations of existing sites and seeks for critical engagements with the local communities. And from 2019 to 2021, Van was a part of the curatorial team at the Factory of Contemporary Art Center, and since 2022, Van has been the artistic director of Art Space, an artist-driven independent space for experimental practices in Hanoi, Vietnam. And here we have Professor Tram Luong. And Tram is a visual anthropologist and multimedia art practitioner. Her doctoral research impacts issues surrounding the construction of Vietnamese otherness in Cambodia, focusing on expressions of anti-Vietnam antagonisms and indifferent conjunctures of Cambodian history. And her works span the gap between contemporary art and academia and have been presented at a number of international conferences, such as the Asian Studies Conference in Japan and Visualizing Asia at SOAS, London. It has also appeared in the Journal of Peasant Studies, Anthropology Now, and on Our Times, the digital journal of Times Museum. And so I'll give the floor to the guest speakers, and Jam will help moderate this discussion.
Thank you so much. Hello to the audience in Hanoi as well. This is one of the very kind of logistically challenging setup that we try to do here at Fulbright. The reason being is White Noise, the exhibition of Winner Foundation, invited a very excellent emerging curator from Hanoi. And at this point in time, we want Vietnamese contemporary art to be as inclusive, as hybrid and diverse as possible. So you are kind of entering that space of experimentation with us. Now for today's, I have the privilege of having watched and looked at all of the films curated by May Adadol critically. I think this is a very excellent curation coming out of a very interesting question. So I want to kind of follow up on that and ask May and Vân a couple of questions. But the nature of this is going to be a conversation, so that I hope everyone here and everyone in Hanoi as well would be joining us in this. So just to get us started, I want to kind of come back to the origin of what you just watched. So we watched a series of 5 very kind of short films, vary a lot in style and content. But these was all of the films that were commissioned by curator May Adadol in 2022, I believe. And it came out of a very interesting questions. What does a legacy taste, smell, sounds, feel, or look like? And the 5 filmmakers has to create their work in response to that particular inquiry. And we had very different kind of vision of what legacy feel like. But one thing in common that run through all of this film is all of the filmmakers actually is based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And there's also, if you want to kind of investigate more about this project, there's a very excellent writing resources online. It's called the Legacy Readers, and it is available for free online with all the information about this curatorial project. So now, May, I want to kind of getting started and ask you a questions about the experience of curating this series of work. And in particular, can you talk a little bit more about this experience of curations as commissions?
Hi, and thank you so much to the hosts and the audiences in Hanoi and Saigon. It's a real privilege to be able to share this project with you. So I'm just going to start by a particular way that I worked with this project, and the underlying theme, which I hope will be of interest here, is also to do with models of artists' moving image curation. So maybe the most common way that people associate art with activities of curating would be exhibition making, and exhibition making in the sense of a curator working with artists and institutions in the sense of selecting already finished work. What's different about this project is that it is a commissioning project. So there is also another way, another model of moving image curation. And personally, I think this is perhaps a more productive and a more absorbing way to work with artists, which is that as a curator, the hat that you wear is you are the person who helps to facilitate, who helps to commission new works to be made. So the background context of this project is that Legacies sit within a long-term artist moving image commissioning project initiated by an institution called Circuit. Circuit is an artist moving image distributor and agency based in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and whose director is Mark Williams. And Circuit's remit is certainly to support and to increase the visibility of New Zealand artists, but increasingly Circuit is also broadening its definition of being an artist moving image distributor and agency to also be aspiring to work with artists from outside of New Zealand as well. So each year, Circuit invites a curator at large, to be part of the commissioning process. And then what happens is that the invited curator each year would work with Circuit to approach 5 artists, 4 of whom will be artists based in New Zealand and 1 international artist, to approach 5 artists to ask if they would be interested to create new work as part of the commissioning process. And then the artists are invited to make work, which maybe we can call them short films, maybe we can call them artist moving image works, whose duration tend not to be longer than around between 10 to 20 minutes, sometimes shorter. The whole process takes about a year, and then Circuit would then take the responsibility, with the help of the curator at large, to try to find venues. So to work with such venues as art galleries, academic institutions, film festivals, to place these works in international venues around the world. Mark Williams invited me to come on board with the 2022 iteration of this project at the point when Circuit was reaching 10 years. So this is the sort of 10th birthday anniversary project of Circuit, if you like. And Mark approached me with a very open brief. So just the structure of this project, the commissioning structure, would I like to work with 5 artists, 4 of whom would be based in New Zealand, and work with the artists to facilitate the artistic creation of a new short form moving image work. So I jumped at the opportunity partly to learn about moving image, artist moving image practices in New Zealand, and partly to see whether I could come up with ways to facilitate explorations of maybe common or resonating themes of concern between artists situated in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and artists situated in Southeast Asia. So one of my long-standing interests is this question of what are the legacies that have a hold over us? What are the legacies that we embody, and what are the legacies that we can't shake off? And my interest in this idea of legacies, there are a couple of elements to this interest. One is the idea that maybe the way that we embody or that we carry certain legacies, whether we like it or not, it's not so much a matter of will as a matter of embodiment. So we relate to certain legacies in a bodily way, in a sensorial way, in a psychic way. And we also relate to those legacies in a way that also means that we are part of a society, an ecology, or a group of people who embody some of the same things, but obviously who has different relationships to that which we embody. And then the second reason why I'm so preoccupied by this notion of legacies is that there is a dialectics here. Sometimes there may be certain legacies which we embody and we are maybe proud, maybe happy, maybe willing to be the transmitter or to be the recipient of this or that historical legacy. But there are also certain legacies where we might experience this with the affects of shame, negative feelings, negative emotion, negative affects, something which we can't really will away, we can't really shake off. So really those were the two sort of strands of interest that I brought around the idea of legacies into this project. The process of commissioning was a really, really interesting one. So in the initial stage, I worked with Mark Williams. So Mark would suggest, I told Mark about this. This is the interest that I want to bring into the project. Mark then generated came up with some ideas about which New Zealand-based artists he thought would be particularly interesting to work with, or would have maybe some kind of shared interests in my interest in this idea. And then we also, so out of that process, we made a decision on a number of the artists that we wanted to invite. So we approached 4 New Zealand-based artists. Edith Amituanai, who is a New Zealand artist of Pacific Islands heritage. Martin Sagadin, also a New Zealand artist of Slovenian heritage. Sriwhana Spong, New Zealand artist of Balinese heritage. And Pati Tyrell, New Zealand artist of Pacific Islands, Samoan heritage. And then I invited another artist, a Thai artist called Ukrit Sa-nguanhai, to come on board as well. And Ukrit is an artist / researcher and is doing a PhD with me. So the work, Ukrit's work that you see in the program, that's work that he made as a way to pilot his idea. He made that right at the beginning of his PhD studies process, and the work that serves 2 purposes. One is to be part of this commissioning project, and another one is also to try out some of the ideas for his PhD. So maybe I'll just pause there, and then love to hear people's thoughts on what they make of the works in the program, either the program as a whole or each of the works in the program.
Yes, for sure. Before we jump into other questions, go into the conceptuals, I just want to ask if you can elaborate a little bit more on the context of display for this body of work. Are the works supposed to be viewed individually as installations work, or perhaps as a series always viewed together, like the form that we had today?
So the way that Circuit conceives of this commissioning project, so not just for my iteration, but all the artists' commissioning project that it's done. It's in order to commission 5 short form works that could be shown in a single screen cinematic setting. So that's basically, in terms of the exhibition context, that's really the only sort of starting point for this commissioning project. And then beyond that, where possible, Circuit would also work with non-cinematic exhibition contexts to place the work as well. For the Legacies program, the first exhibition was at an art gallery called Art Space in Auckland, in New Zealand. So the project launched at Art Space Gallery, but what the gallery did was then to create a kind of single screen, so a cinematic projection, pop-up cinema kind of context for presenting the work. And since then, it's traveled to various locations and types of venues around the world. So at ADM Gallery in Singapore, the work was presented in an installation context, and the curators there then created a sort of installation where one work would occupy one part of the gallery. It would play on loop on one screen. So in that context, the exhibition took the form of something that's much more like a group show, an artist moving image group show installed with also some of the wall spaces used as a space of display in itself, in the sense that there were also extracts and quotes from the Legacies reader presented as if that was also in some ways part of the exhibition. So it's not just the wall text. In other contexts, some of the work, so Pati's work, Taluna Lalagi and Ukrit's work, Trip After, those were selected by Oberhausen Film Festival for Pati's work and Berlin International Film Festival for Ukrit's work. So in that case, the behind the scene, the functioning was more that Mark has wore the hat of a distributor, submitted these programs to various film festivals around the world, and then the decision-making power would be with the film festivals. Did they want all of the works? Did they want one of the works to be shown in different strands of their festival? So at the Berlin International Film Festivals, Ukrit's work was presented in the more experimentally inclined, non-competitive strand of, that was the 2023 festival, so Forum expanded. In the case of Pati's work, that went into the competition, international competition program of Oberhausen Film Festival. So there are sort of various spatial and institutional exhibition contexts that this project was designed to be able to encompass. But the starting idea is that this commissioning process would be able to produce 5 works that could be shown as single screen work, as like a short film program in a cinema, black box cinema auditorium setting.
I have one more question before I defer to the audience. I really respond to the qualities of embodiment that you point out within the project of curations. As you say, embodiment is something that we can, that we comprehend in a very kind of multi-dimensional manner. In a way, I think the film responds to that idea very well, because some of them really communicate the idea not through the visual, but perhaps the sonic. Some communicate it in a very different way as well, by reference of touch, for example. And I think this is the notes that dovetail very well with White Noise, the exhibition that we had at the Nguyen Foundation, in which Van Do kind of curated a vision of this kind of contemporary bodies of Vietnamese subjectivities. But I will defer to her to talk more about that. So I just wonder if you both can talk more about this concept of embodiment, and in particular, Van, if it's possible, can you talk to us about how you came across Legacy and brought your project into conversation with this series of film?
So a little bit of the background of White Noise for those who haven't seen it in person. So White Noise is actually a group exhibition that I curated from a collection of the Nguyen Foundation. And so at Nguyen Foundation, they have quite a very big and also historically important collection of contemporary Vietnamese artworks. And as a very young curator, to be receiving that invitation to curate from the collection, I had quite a difficult time thinking how I should position myself in the very complex but also multi-dimensional collection. And and most of the works actually are from are by artists from generation that I am not very so they were born in the generation before I was born. So I couldn't really grasp what the context of the artworks in my personal history. So that is also where the question of legacy came to me personally. And so when I encounter May's project Legacy, I read through the project, and I had a lot of the question resolved, because I feel like I feel like maybe it's also relief for me to feel like maybe legacy isn't always something that is pleasant to carry on. So maybe it's okay to feel uncomfortable having certain legacies. So I think with that in mind, I really also want to learn from May's curation also, because I, like you said, I curate from an existing body of works, while you kind of have an opposite approach to what I did, is how you work with the artist from the conception of the works until the realization of the works. Well, in my case, I was like trying to recontextualize the work in my own perspective. So I feel like maybe I could learn from the approach that is completely opposite to how I did. Yeah.
I mean, that's a terrific way to place each of our projects in a relationship with each other, and I particularly like the way that you cast it as. Sorry, I'm just getting a bit of echo and interference in. So I think what's really fascinating about taking up the role of the curator is precisely this thing. I mean, you talk really beautifully about the thinking and maybe the difficulties to grapple with in working with an existing body of work. And the job of the curator is to recontextualize, and yet at the same time also to make sure that the exhibition that you create honor the singularity and the authorial agency of the artist. And I think here, always it's fascinating, you know, the curatorial voice and the artistic voice, intentions and agenda. In my case, I started from the other end, and so myself and Edith, Martin, Sri, Ukrit and Pati, we then had to establish a process and a rhythm of being in conversation and relating our interests around this question of legacies in a way that, well, maybe the two things that I have to mention. And one is that apart from Ukrit, this was going into this project was the first time that I had encountered and I had struck up friendship and professional working relationship with Edith, Martin, Sri and Pati. So in some ways it also felt a tiny little bit like a blind date in the beginning. A lot of fun. And also that most of the time I live and work in the UK. Sometimes, quite a lot of the time, I'm in Southeast Asia. Edith, Martin and Pati, most of the time, are in New Zealand. Sri, most of the time is in London. Ukrit, most of the time is in Thailand. And we were doing this during COVID. So actually, most of the time, that process of feeling our way into working with each other as, you know, curator and artist, that took place long distance. And then I felt and this was the very first time that I had gotten an opportunity to curate a commissioning project. So I didn't know. I had no rule book about how you would do this, but I had to figure out a way to make sure that my interest in my preoccupation with this legacies thing is strictly the starting point and the prompt for each of the artists. And that in no way could this process be one where I have this idea and I invite 5 people to create the content for me. So I think this is where, you know, the challenge and the sensitivity and the absolute sort of intriguingness, absorbingness of this commissioning process. It was, you know, trying to precisely figuring this out, that my idea really exists only as a prompt. And then beyond that, it was really up to the working process of each of the artists, how much each of the artists needs me and at what point, and what each of the artists needs me for. That is the agency there, and what I was drawing on was the experience also of each of the artists. I think all of them, how they then proceeded was Edith, for instance, her long-standing practice, she is a very well-respected artist photographer in New Zealand, and she had very, very well known for creating wonderful photographic portraits of people of Pacific Islands descendant. So she was interested in bringing in this interest, but using this opportunity to make not photographic work, but artist moving image work. I use that as an example of the way the artists then both connected my interest with their own interests, and also they then found a way to use this commissioning process, which is not very long. The commissioning process, which is a year long, is really not very long. Each of them found a way to use that commissioning process to maybe go adapt an existing practice or a project in development, and to use this opportunity maybe to go to either extend that or to go in a slightly different direction. So it's also, I think, productive to see the work that they create as part of a broader practice for each of the artists, as maybe, you know, an element of figure work that they were and they are also developing. Sriwhana, that's very much the case. So the gorgeous animation poems, I think of Ukrit as a kind of animation poem, that came out of Sriwhana's much longer process of developing another project as a way to work with I believe a Javan artist dancer, and as a way to go deep and engage with the 16th century, the form of 16th century Javanese poetry. So this project she took as an opening to try to see if she could make animation work, drawing on the form of a kind of a type of 16th century Javanese poetry.
Hi, May. On the note of poetry, can you talk very briefly about the way you started out with this prompt for the project? I remember in the Legacy readers, you mentioned you was in the process of learning how to write poetry, right?
Ah, okay. Yeah, so in the Legacies reader, I told a story about when Mark approached me with this project. It was around time the pandemic, and as one of the things that I did to sort of survive the uncertainty of the pandemic was I thought I'd try to write a poem in order to just explore another register of writing. Because I think actually another thing that really fascinates me about the practice of curating, or maybe a curatorial method of facilitating artistic work, or even you can think about this also in another sense, a curatorial method as method of arts research, let's say. Writing is a very important part of that, and different functions, forms, and registers of writing is a very essential part of that. So to learn to develop different forms, functions, and voices of writing as a curator, I think is hugely fascinating, and in some ways rather liberating for someone who spent most of her life in a context of writing which is this academic context with its many, many strengths, but also many, many limitations and weaknesses. So I got hold of a book, and it's a very interesting book. It's a book that teaches you to write poetry by encouraging you to take the structure and the scaffolding of existing poems. And then basically you learn to write. That becomes the prompt for the novice writer of poetry in order to try to then generate your own poem, but depending on the structure and the scaffolding of existing poems. So Sri and I very strongly, that was the aspect that we very strongly connected around. So the potential, we can think of this as a question of intergenerational transmission or artistic transmission. So the potential to create something new, both through the form of repetition and also through the form of receiving, inhabiting or appropriating a certain scaffolding or structure of an existing poetic or artistic work. So that was how a sort of tacit, formal, and aesthetic interest, if you like, underlying this project is poetry, but poetry in its capacity to create something new or to go deeper into something, to go into the unknown through forms of repetition, forms of incantation, and actually through certain possibilities of appropriation. I find that very, very fascinating. And maybe I also want to throw out this thought, so looping back to this question, that the other sort of, underlying interest, the core of this project is around the question of embodiment and legacies. I think it's thinking back now, because I've lived with these works and I'm now firm friends with all of these fantastic artists. So now thinking back now on the work that they've made, I think it's really, really fascinating that we can also maybe approach 5 works in this program as both very embodied, very sensorial, and that quality of embodiment also seems to be linked. In each case in specific ways, maybe we can sort of identify this as an underlying thread. That quality of embodiment seems to be very linked to this question of intergenerational relations, possibilities of transmissions, tensions between the generations. And I find it, sort of 18 months or so of sort of living with the artist's work. I think to me, maybe this is a quality and a gift that this program gives to me is thinking, in order to encourage thinking around this question of intergenerational relations, transmission maybe or maybe not, and embodiment. embodied forms.
Thank you so much, May. For the interest of time, because May is also very busy and had to leave us around 4, I would like to invite the audience, if you have any questions, maybe comments about the film as well, or comments about the exhibitions for Ven and May, we would love to hear from you at this point. And the same invitation for the audience in Hanoi. Go ahead, Ven.
Yeah, I actually have a question for May. Like, in the process of working with the artists, do you facilitate any conversation between them, or you work with them individually?
In the process of developing the work, that was one-to-one, individually. Edith and Sri and Pati already know each other. The exhibition making process was really the point where some of us got to spend time together, and I think that's also the afterlife of the sort of commissioning process. I think is also very important. So a couple of months ago, when Legacies traveled to Bangkok, and I worked with an art space called Storage Art Space to exhibit the works there as single screen installation, and I created quite a lot of public programs for that iteration in Bangkok. Then it was a wonderful time. Pati and Martin came over and spent quite a lot of time in Bangkok, engaging with the audience, taking part in the public programs, and because they did that, we were also able to then create sort of interconnected programs sitting alongside Legacies, a little bit like what we're doing now, right? Your exhibition and the way that sort of, you know, you're inviting Legacies to kind of be in parallel, adjacent to it. So we were also able to do some screening programs, because Pati is part of a really important queer Indigenous Pacific Islands collective based in South Auckland called FAFSWAG. So Pati and Tanu Gago, another artist, filmmaker, and member of FAFSWAG, came, spent a lot of time in Bangkok, and then showed some of the well, not quite documentary, let's put it, moving image and music performance video works. We showed that at a documentary micro cinema in Bangkok. So in terms of the reunion, interacting, meeting each other for the first time, Legacies in Bangkok, Ukrit being already based in Bangkok, was also very much a part of that. That tended to happen more as part of the exhibition making and public programming process.
I have a question for May as well. How do you deal with risk management regarding commissioned artworks from the conception to the realization of the artwork? And when is an artwork deemed finished for the commission? Because you are an invited curator for Circuit as well.
I think what I learned from the privilege of being able to learn how to do a commissioning project, and I've only done one, so you know, very much a novice. I think the time limitation of the process, I learned, I think this is probably a recurring risk factor, and that possibly, where possible, the job of a curator in this context is to, as much as possible, be the artist's conversational partner if they need it, when they need it, in the development of ideas. And then I think the other key aspect of the job is to do what you can to help as far as possible to make time and space that the artist can then develop the work. And here, in some contexts, you may have a lot of power and agency to stretch that time and space for the artist to make the work. In other instances, you may not have that much agency, but I think there should be an effort to try to stretch and to make room. And then the last bit of the work, that's a more common bit, which is around and more commonly recognizable as the job of a curator, I guess, which is to help represent the work well, place the work, make exhibitions, do as good a job as you can in terms of creating, accompanying written or verbal discourses to help draw people's attention to what's significant, what's of interest about these works. My sense is the commissioning process, the risk factor would be around this question of limitation, finitude, time, because we all have experience of this in various contexts of creation, right? The deadline sometimes is very productive. Other times it could be that it's the deadline cycle that drives the production of the work. That's a risk factor. And I think the other risk factor is this thing about the role of the curator in a commissioning process is to prompt, to support, to facilitate, and to be careful not to overstep that boundary into being overly authorial in terms of your desire for works to be created that maybe is a demonstration of your particular interest or your particular hang-up and obsession.
I actually have a follow-up question to my previous one. So I feel like sometimes legacy is very much tied to the place of its origin. And so as this project travels around the world, do you have a fear of misrepresenting certain contexts? Because I feel like for me, myself, I don't really feel familiarized with the context of New Zealand, and especially the filmmakers who also come from different heritage backgrounds. So yeah, do you have that? Do you feel the need to facilitate the context while the project travels to different contexts? Yeah.
Certainly. You have to make a judgment call on, in which context, in relation to which places and topic you, the curator, your history, your body, the way that you're entangled in specific historical legacies yourself, you feel you can speak to that. And in other contexts, at what point is it your role to actually step back and invite either the artists themselves or those who are more descended from or entangled within this or that historical context to do the contextualization and speaking. So with this project, I would tend to, in terms of questions of historical contextualization, I can speak most only in relation to Ukrit's work, because Ukrit's work, we're sort of historical subjects in the same kind of historical process and crises. it was essential when we brought the project to Bangkok to invite Pati and Martin to be present, and I think also to contextualize the questions of the experiences, questions of cultural ownership and struggles, ancestral cultural ownership of Aotearoa in New Zealand. I think it was essential that it was Pati who introduced those sorts of insights to audiences in Bangkok, who in most cases were totally unfamiliar, right, with these questions, this facet of historical experience. I had a really intriguing a moment when I really learned a lot from the process of presenting this project was when I joined an online discussion, and this was in the context of Legacies being presented in a single screen installation format at Adams Art Gallery in New Zealand. So I joined the talk a little much like this, and then that was one of the first times that I was able to listen into audience responses and conversations with some of the artists. Martin was there presenting their work and the project. So I was able to listen in to that conversation between the audience and Martin, and it was really interesting because Martin's work, Garden of Clay, that gesture of the white New Zealand artist, Martin's friend, Caitlin, digging the clay from a riverbank part as part of a circular process of making pottery work, so artistic practice. You make pottery work. The process starts with returning work to the soil and then digging up the clay to make new work. Somebody like myself, not being part of the history of New Zealand's history of colonization, its legacies there around the question of indigenous cultural ownership, ways to think about and continue to practice everyday life and also artistic and institutional practice which honors indigenous cultural ownership. So this gesture of a white New Zealand woman taking the clay from the riverbank in order to make artistic work. So the sort of the thoughts that came up around that, and the question of whether this is a gesture that could be made in the context of this film, even in that gesture, talking with Martin afterwards and learning more at that point about what sort of intentionally placed tacitly there in the work. It really is around the question of the Caitlin, the white New Zealand artist, as being someone whose artistic practice, as evoked by this work, says tacit things about historical legacies, in the sense that Caitlin is descended from grandparents who migrated to New Zealand to be part of industries such as mining, an industry which is now recast as part of sort of colonial extraction industry. So the question of who artistically has the right to make work and who has the right to be seen on the screen as making that gesture, and how sensitive and live that discussion is in that context was not something that I could have anticipated in advance. And I think this is precisely because, the question here is really, where are you situated and what are the histories that make you who you are? And as a curator, it wasn't something that I could then have raised in relation to this project. So I think the question of knowing when you can speak and in what context do you step back and you invite others who are very much more part of this or that history to do the speaking. I think it's very much part of the responsibility and the judgment that you have to make when you wear the hat of a curator for a project. And you know, that discussion was intriguing to me because I can know in the abstract that the tensions around the question of cultural ownership in New Zealand is very live, but I can only know this in the abstract. It's not something that I can know sensorially, but it was a real privilege to be able to listen into that conversation and just to sense, to observe how live those discussions are.
Thank you, May, for such thought-provoking response. And I think time is running out, so maybe we can wrap up with one more question from the audience. Should there be any?
May I use that?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, thanking May for such thought-provoking response. And time is running out, so we're just opening the floor up to one more question, and then we'll wrap up the discussion.
Hi May, it's Pamela. Just a brief question, I know we're out of time. So we have a lot of undergraduate students here, a lot of sophomores, juniors, and seniors, and they like to write honors theses, they like to make films, they like to make artworks, and we really encourage them to explore research as something multidimensional and multimodal. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how this concept of legacies ties into some of the academic work that you've done. I can kind of get a sense of some of the resonances across your curatorial projects, and are there ways in which it dovetails with some of the scholarship that you've been working on or plan to work on?
So this project links, not overtly, but I'm doing this project and I'm writing a book on Southeast Asian contemporary artist moving image. And the book asks, why do a good number of these works have animistic forms, animistic poetic forms? And what I'm trying to argue is that in order to understand that, one of the things we have to try to understand is the legacy or the afterlife of artistic and cultural vanguardism in the region and in countries in the region. So 20th century, particularly mid-20th century modes of artistic and cultural vanguardism. So in that sense, you can kind of see that obliquely, the curatorial and the writing work that I do, they revolve around this question of, what is the afterlife, the legacy of avant-garde or dissident artistic movements. I also, in my more overtly sort of film historical work, so for a while, I was doing research and I was writing articles on outdoor film screenings, primarily in Thailand, but this phenomenon, and various models of outdoor film screenings obviously existed in many, many places around the world. And tacitly, my interest there was to blast away a certain historiographic legacy of how how people write about film history. So the form, the epistemological form of that film history as being one in which the history is made by a small number of individuals, by various elite pioneering figures, which in the Thai case tended to be sort of this prince and this king or whatever. So here also, although the use this term, the agenda there, I guess you could say, is very much tied with my interest in historical legacies in the sense of that which, politics and ideology, which shape certain ways that we make knowledge, certain structures of historical narrativization that we keep repeating. And then, one of the sort of tacitly, one of the things I was doing when I was doing that itinerant cinematic practices project as film historical research is to propose, go towards other ways that you could do historiographic work. And also meaning that other ways of doing historiographic work over time became why not do things beyond writing? Why not do curatorial work as research method?
All right, thank you so much, May, Van, and also Jam for this very wonderful discussion and also coordination for this program. And thank you, Aspace and Fulbright University for hosting the program. A video documentation of the talk today will be uploaded onto May Art Foundation's website and social media in the future, so please look out for it. Should you want to revisit. And yeah.
So, thank you so much again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, May and John.
Except for the echoes. Yeah. Otherwise, so good. We'll have like a recording of everyone who was on the phone.
Oh.